All right. So I'm gonna have us work it out by hand, and then we'll get to our technology. Find the variance and standard deviation for brand B of paint. The months are in 35, 45, 30, 35, 40, and 25. So I want to use those formulas above. I'm going to find the variance first and then apply the square root after, but it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to make a table to help me, and I'm going to say my x values, which are these data values, 35, 45, 30, 35, 40, and 25. Then we want to be able to apply these formulas. So I'm going to look at what the pieces that I need. Pieces I need for these. So if we're talking about our variance, we're looking at, we need our x and we need an x bar. So that means we need to find a mean. So let's find a mean of this and figure out what the mean of our paints are. So we can either do that by adding them up and dividing, or use your technology, whichever way you want to do it. Let's find the mean. So the mean is 35. So I'm going to use that and follow that first top piece, which says x minus x bar. So we're going to have 35 minus 35. So 0. 45 minus 35. So that gives me 10. 30 minus 35. Negative 5. 35 minus 35. 0. 40 minus 35. And 25 minus 35. Negative 10. All right, now there's another piece to this formula up here which says we want to square that number. So those numbers that we just got, including the negative, you want to square them. So 0 squared gives me 0. 10 squared gives me 100. Negative 5 squared gives me 25. 0 squared is just 0. 5 squared, 25. And negative 10 squared gets me to 100. Questions on that? All right, now this big sigma that's in front tells me to add all of those up. So let's add this column and see what the total is. 250. And then I'm going to get my variance, which is sigma squared, by taking 250. And I want to divide by n minus 1. What's my n? 6. So 6 minus 1. So 250 divided by 5. What does that give us? 50? All right. Now that's my variance. So if I want the standard deviation, how can I get that? Square root. So S equals the square root of 50, which is equal to 7 point, what? 07? .07? Okay. I'm going to again find the sample, and this time they specifically told me sample, so I know what I'm working with. Variance and standard deviation for the amount of European auto sales for the sample of 6 years shown. The data are in millions of dollars. So for my calculator, I want to put all of this in, say, list 1. And we're going to run our favorite thing, which is 1var stats on that list 1. So we got 11.2. 11.12. And since we're only dealing with one list of data, if yours is set up like mine, you'll leave frequency blank. We don't want to put anything in there. All right, which one of these do you suppose is supposed to be my standard deviation? Huh? Oh, I might have typed something in wrong. That happens to me. Yep. That should be 11.9. Makes a big difference. So let's try that again. Does that look better? All right. So which one do we think is our standard deviation? Is it sigma or is it S? Are we talking about a sample or a population? Sample, and which one goes along with sample? My S. So this S of X goes along with the sample. If we were talking about a population, we would take the sigma off of there instead. So our standard deviation is 1.13 for rounding's sake. So S is equal to 1.13. And this is, just as a note, standard deviation. Now, if we look at our calculator, it doesn't give me an S squared, right? Does that bother me? I hope not. How can I get the variance? Square that number. So the variance, which is S squared, is equal to 1.13 squared. And let's see what we get. Two, 8, 6. Like 1.28. Okay. We can leave it there. The midpoint, and then we need to figure out the X data points that go along with it. We're going to find the frequency times our X value, and then we need the frequency times our X value squared. We're going to have to use a couple pieces of information here. So I'm going to figure out, let's just call this, for short, I'm going to say my F and my X. So I'm going to do X times our F. So we'll get 1 times 8 and 2 times 13. And our 3 times 18. 5 times 23. 4 times 28. 3 times 33. And 2 times 38. So we get 8, 26, 54, 5 times 23, what was that? 115. 4 times 28, was that 112? And then 99 and 76, I think. That was the information we used for our mean last time. And then the new part that we need for the standard deviation is to take our I'm going to take the X value and square it. And then I want to multiply it by that frequency. So we're going to say 8 squared times 1. And 13 squared times 2. 18 squared times 3. 23 squared times 5. 28 squared times 4. 33 squared times 3. And lastly, 38 squared times 2. Version of the pieces that we need in order to actually do this. And I'm going to do it for the variance, and then we can take the square root to get our standard deviation. So we need the our n. And what was our n for this? How many runners do we have? 20. All right. So we're going to take our n and we're going to multiply it by the frequency, or the x's squared times the frequency. So the sum of our x's squared times that frequency. Then we're going to subtract from that our x times the sum of our x's times our frequency squared. And the bottom has to be adjusted slightly too. We have to do n times n minus 1 in order to get a frequency distribution to work properly. So I'm going to fill in each of those pieces. So my n is 20. So everywhere I have an n, I'll put my 20. And then the sum of my x's squared times the frequencies is that 13,310. And we're going to subtract from that the sum of the x's times the frequencies, which is our 490. And I want to square the 490 in the end. So it's not pretty, but it's doable. Now let's see what our variance equals. $68.68? All right. Do we all agree? Perfect. So if I have that as my variance, what is my standard deviation going to be? If I have the variance, how do I get to the standard deviation? Take the square root of it. So 68.68 square rooted, that's going to get me to 8.29. All right. Because it's only 20 runners, right? I probably don't have all the runners for a week. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, and 2. And anytime I'm using a frequency list, it should be the same length as my data list. So it should be the same length as that midpoint list, so it knows how much each one of those numbers is supposed to happen. And then I'll go over to my 1var stats, tell it where my midpoint list is, which for me is in list 1. And this is the time that I actually need to tell it that second list, which is L2, where my frequencies happen. If yours doesn't look like mine, remember you put them list 1 with a comma list 2, so it knows you want to look at both lists. And we'll calculate. If we round, our S of x matches the standard deviation that we got by hand, right? We're going to get to 8.29. And we would take our 8.29 and square it to get back to the variance. But we can still get both numbers. Any questions?